for having me, Luca and Ivana, and for you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and I'm honored to be here at the Institute of Philosophy. I've only been in Zagreb 2 days, but I find it a really nice city, and I'm very happy to be here. So this talk is based on archive research I was doing for a book just prior to the pandemic. And so I was doing archive research at the Bodleian Library in Oxford and the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin and the British Library in London, trying to understand maybe if there were any issues with the medieval transmission of certain terms in Aristotle's biological corpus, because I was trying to understand why some modern interpretations of Aristotle on animals didn't seem to fit with my overall impression of the way he seemed to be interested in animals in his time. And I thought my research was getting exciting. I was thinking, you know, I'd maybe found something interesting, and then the pandemic hit and I wasn't able to complete in-person research in Florence, and but luckily I was in contact with Peter Boulians, which maybe you know. He's a world-class scholar on William Moore-Becca, and he helped me find the manuscripts online so that I was able to complete the research I wanted to do during the pandemic online. And then after the pandemic, this has become a chapter in a book that I just submitted to Brill. So hopefully I have a book coming out on Aristotle on animals, and really about animal ethics from a classical point of view. So again, this is just a piece of that book, and a piece that's sharing some of the manuscript research that I was doing over the last few years. Okay, so the Aristotelian neologism eŭviotis and its cognates appears in Aristotle's Historia and Animalium, Book 9, which is Book 8 in the transmissions prior to Theodore of Gaza's 15th century translation, examining the context of the term and Aristotle's observations of bird character. I will argue that eŭviotis has been mistranslated historically as feeding well, possibly owing to infelicities on account of implicit anthropocentrism seen in two 15th century translations of the text by George of Trebizond and Theodoro Gaza. Whereas concerns about Trebizond's relatively unpopular translation may be attributed in part to the reading of the difficult Greek and his interpretation of the context, liberties that Gaza took with Aristotle's text were likely influenced by the attention Gaza paid to Trebizond's translation while preparing his own. But while Trebizond might be the original source of various inaccuracies, Gaza's more popular manuscript ends up at fault for the lasting impact their non-literal translation has had on Aristotle studies. To this end, I will point to the scholarly influence Gaza's translations had on certain subsequent translations, principally Sir Darcy Wentworth Thompson's early 20th century English translation, following David Baum's suggestion in the late 20th century Loeb critical edition of the Historia and Animalium that eŭviotis seems to mean more than feeding well. I will defend Baum's rendering living well, with support from William of Moore-Becca's 13th century translation and to the 9th century Arabic translation of the relevant texts. My aim, finally, is to propose that for Aristotle, bird teleology is not reducible to the ability to eat, and therefore to help expand our idea about the ways Aristotle did think about the capacities for life and for living well inherent in certain non-human animal species. Is my pace okay, or is it understandable? Okay, just tell me if it's too fast or too slow. Okay, so a brief outline of the Historia and Animalium for anyone who's not familiar with the text. Aristotle's naturalism, the stunning collection of observations and ideas about non-human animal life and function, is largely contained in the extant books of the Historia and Animalium, or History of Animals. The general outline of the work is as follows. Books 1 through 3 deal with the parts or the details of the material biology of blooded animals. Books 4 through 6 deal with the parts of bloodless animals. differences in sense faculties, voice, sleep, and dreaming, sex and secondary sex characteristics, and generation. Book 7 deals with human reproduction, and books 8 through 9 deal with differences in non-human animal character, activities, nutrition, environment, way of life, health and disease, reproduction, friendships, and enmity. The work is intended to be a collection of facts, a genuine historia, an inquiry on or researched account of the way things are, whence analysis could be subsequently drawn. As Alan Godhealth points out, Aristotle's biological treatises remain the starting point for most study of animals into the 18th century, suggesting the long-standing and indeed historically unmatched influence these works had on readers, later scientists, and indeed on the general Western concept of non-human animal being and identity. Book 10, which is not included in most editions of the HA, both because it is suspected to be spurious, partly because it does not have the character in a Historia, and also because there was a tradition begun in the 15th century of leaving it out of transmissions, provides an account of failed attempts at human generation and the female contribution to human reproduction. In the first pages of Book 8, Aristotle announces that animal activities and lives differ according to their character and nutrition. This conjunction gestures to the themes explored in the following naturalist accounts. Nutrition is dealt with in the rest of Book 8, and character is covered in Book 9. And so I'm going to focus on Book 9. In the HA 9, Aristotle progresses from discussing feeding habits and migratory patterns of various non-human animals to talking specifically about their character. His introductory paragraph is especially instructive here, so I will quote it in its entirety. The characters of the animals are less obvious to us by perception in the case of the less developed and shorter-lived ones, but more obvious in the longer-lived, for they are seen to have a certain natural capacity in relation to each of the soul's affections, to intelligence and stupidity, courage and cowardice, to mildness and ferocity, and the other dispositions of the sort. Certain animals at the same time are receptive of some learning and instruction, some from each other, some from humans, that is all that have some hearing, not just those that hear sounds, but also those that distinguish the differences between the signs. And I just have to interject, it's interesting that a study just came out about dogs that they don't just hear words, that they hear strings of words and they understand the meaning. And so it's interesting that, here in Aristotle's Book 9, we're seeing that he's making the distinction between hearing sounds and actually distinguishing. The context of HA 9 is an investigation of the character of animals, meaning the natural capacities as regards the soul's affections. The examples Aristotle then gives for such capacities of the soul's affections include, along with their opposites, practical wisdom, intelligence, courage, and mildness. It is in the context of this book, and specifically in his observations about bird character, that we encounter the term eŭviotis, whose root is the term bios, or life, and the prefix eu, meaning good or well. Scholars have been divided over time about how to interpret this term, especially given the context of bird life. The rest of this section will be dedicated to understanding the term better, providing a reading of the subsequent relevant passages in HA 9. According to the TLG, eŭviotis and cognates are only found in Aristotle and in Aristotle's extant corpus. They appear 10 times, all in his observations of birds in the context of his work on animal character. Naturally, as a neologism coming out of Aristotle, we must examine the context of the passages in which these occur in order to determine a relatively confident rendering of the term to present-day modern language. Aristotle's first topic of character in Book 9 is polemos, providing many varied examples of animals who are at war. For example, the eagle and dragon snake, the crow and the owl, the turtle dove and the paralis, the kite and raven, the gecko and spider, the horse and the heron, the wolf and the ass, among others. Each example has something to do with competition over livelihood or food. And I think, yeah, here I have a collection here. At the end of this section, Aristotle concludes, in these wild animals, their friendships, filiae, and wars, polemoi, happen because of their feeding and way of life. Although Aristotle has already covered bird nutrition in Book 8, especially in Chapter 3, he notes here a connection between adequate nutrition and character. He concludes the disposition of certain character traits results from the availability and competition for nutrition, trophos, and way of life. In his description of animals at war, Aristotle uses eŭviotis for the first time. Here Aristotle says of the anthos, the anthos lives beside the river and marshes, its color is beautiful, and it eŭviotis. What could Aristotle intend to communicate with this term? What is good about the way the anthos lives? Looking at the context of the passage, Aristotle has been talking here generally about two particular dispositions of character, the friendship and the war, the filiae and the polemos. The term might have to do with anthos' ability to navigate friendship and enmity made possible by adequate food and or a certain manner of lifestyle, but there are not enough reference or contextual clues to say for sure at this point. Let us have a look then at other occurrences of eŭviotis in the HA and of their context. In the second chapter of HA 9, which begins at 610b1, Aristotle takes up fish, their tendency to form shoals with friends and not with enemies. He mentions the stronger take advantage of the weaker. In the third chapter, Aristotle reminds us that animal character differs with respect to cowardice, mildness, courage, tameness, mind, and ignorance. Aristotle uses the term nous here to refer to mind. According to Balm, this is the only time Aristotle uses nous to refer to non-human animal mind. And he does not intend the technical sense of nous developed in the de anima as a capacity found only in non-humans. Rather, here it is proposed to mean that an animal does learn from experience. In chapters 4, 5, and 6, Aristotle addresses the characters of land dwellers, mostly quadrupeds. In chapter 6, however, he introduces some amphibians. In addition to the other examples of character mentioned and observed so far in Book 9, Aristotle takes notes of additional capacities here. One example is that he notes the interspecies relationship between the crocodile and the trochilus bird. The bird cleans the crocodile's teeth while simultaneously feeding himself. Another example is that he mentions perception in hedgehogs, explaining that hedgehogs have been observed moving the entrance of the holes to their dwellings on account of a change between north and south winds. As Aristotle begins chapter 7, he notes the many instances humans may observe non-human animals seemingly imitating human behavior. In particular, he tells us that these observations can be made more especially in the smaller than in the larger animals. In the smaller animals, he explains, one may see the precision of their intelligence, dianoias. His first example is the swallow's nest building. Following this instruction, Aristotle then continues his discussion of bird character. When speaking about pigeon behavior and character, Aristotle talks about the close relationship between pigeon partners and the general family devotion shown by the pair not only to each other but also to their kin. Aristotle notes that the father pigeon procures suitable food for the young and feeds them. In addition to information regarding fighting with other birds, Aristotle describes the length of claws, life expectancy, and migration patterns. Aristotle next begins chapter 8 contrasting heavy birds with the smaller birds discussed previously. Aristotle notes that these birds do not make nests on grounds and they are not habitual flyers. He continues discussing the heavier birds, noting their ground-level dwellings, the protection they forge against other birds like hawks and eagles, and their rearing of young. He includes a story about the partridge's behavior when faced with human hunters. As he proceeds to discuss partridge and quails, he notes character attributions like bad character, wicked tricks, tame, and wild. Chapter 9 concerns woodpeckers. Seemingly at a loss for character traits, Aristotle discusses the way they are suited for standing on, traveling along, and eating smaller animals from trees. At the end of the chapter, Aristotle recounts a story about a woodpecker who, when being tamed, used his facility with a tree to turn it into a tool he could then use to open an almond for subsequent consumption. Aristotle's transition to chapter 10 is a remark about crane intelligence, phronema. Many instances of intelligence seem to occur among the cranes too, he says. The two seems to refer to the intelligence exhibited by the woodpecker's use of the tree as a tool to open the almond. The cranes are intelligent, according to Aristotle's observations, because they migrate a long way, fly to a great height to survey distance, they change their flying position, flying down when they observe clouds and bad weather, and they have a leader and signals who serve the flock both when flying and also when resting. On this point, Aristotle shares that the leader keeps watch while the others sleep, calling if there is perceived danger. Aristotle closes chapter 10 with a final observation about pelicans. He tells us that they use their own bodies for tools to extract mussels from their shells for consumption. That is, the pelicans swallow them whole and then vomit them up to extract the meat. In chapter 11, Aristotle uses eŭviotis 2 more times. He begins the chapter explaining that wild bird dwellings serve 2 purposes: appropriateness to way of life and security of young. He then notes differences among these birds' characters. Some of them are good parents and care for their young, others the reverse, and some are resourceful in providing a living, others less resourceful. He provides details about different types of dwelling, different types of hunting and eating and laying eggs. As he proceeds to the end of the chapter, Aristotle says that among the birds that dwell on mountains and in woodland, the brenthus, eŭviotis, and is a songster. Then he continues to say about the trochilus, which we would call a wren, that it inhabits thickets and holes. It is difficult to catch and fugitive and weak-charactered, but eŭviotis and is ingenious, technikos. Aristotle then ends chapter 11. It is interesting to note that eŭviotis is a conjunct in both of these attributions, first with songster and then with ingenious. However, in the same clause where it is a conjunct along with ingenious, these qualities are contrasted with its other negative attributions, being difficult to catch, fugitive, and having a weak character. It may be the case that these negative attributions describe only the wren's character and behavior vis-a-vis humans, hence the scare quotes. They are hard to catch, absconding, and weak character in contrast to that of humans and other smaller animals. However, they are admitted to be crafty and eŭviotis. Chapter 12 takes as its subject birds that dwell by water, the ocean, rivers, and lakes. Aristotle notes, residents by sea and rivers and lakes include all the web-footed, for nature seeks what is suitable. As Baum has noted, there is a teleological claim implied in this description, namely that the way these birds naturally are already determines the type of place they will live best. Aristotle had discussed these points at length in the Historia Animalium, Book 8, and now seems to be connecting them to character. Aristotle continues to say that split-footed birds also live by water. His example is again the anthos, which lives alongside rivers, its coloring is beautiful, and it eŭviotis. The term is used again as a conjunct. In this instance, it is paired with beautiful coloring. In addition, Aristotle has established that the bird is dwelling where it is naturally suited to dwell, given its natural parts. Also in chapter 12, Aristotle discusses swans. He says that they are among the web-footed and also spend their lives around lakes and marshes. They eŭviotis and are good-natured, eŭthes, and are good parents, eŭteknoi, and age well, eŭgeiroi. And if the eagle starts a fight, they defend themselves and win, but they do not start a fight themselves. We see Aristotle including the term with 3 other attributes prefixed by eu. Swans not only eŭviotis, but they have a good character, are crafty or resourceful, which Baum translates as good at parenting and age well. And as aforementioned, they live in an area especially suited to their natural body parts. Given this description of their polymos, we might say they are temperate in character, not cowards but not brash either. Chapters 13 and 14 deal chiefly in bird colors and sounds. In chapter 14, Aristotle discusses even the coloring of the halcyon's nest. In describing the nest at length, Aristotle seems to be suggesting its appropriateness to the bird and the bird's particular way of life. For example, that the entrance to the mouth is made such that even when the seawater is violent, the nest will not be flooded. Chapter 14 ends explaining that the halcyon eats mostly fish, uses the fish bones when creating the nest, and notes her reproductive tendencies. Chapter 15 appears to be a collection of disparate observations. We are told that the hoopoe's nest is made of human excrement, that it changes appearance in summer, that the titmouse is the disputed superlative egg layer among birds, that the Libyan sparrow, another contender for superlative egg layer, and the nightingale do not have a sharp point on their tongue. The Agiothos eŭviotis and has many young, polytechnos, but is lame in foot. And that the oriole is good at learning, agathos, resourceful in getting its living, beomekanos, but is not good at flying and is ugly in color. Here, eŭviotis is a conjunct with having many young and being lame in foot. The term eŭviotis, however, is not used in the subsequent line when Aristotle says of the oriole that he is resourceful in getting its living, beomekanos, suggesting that eŭviotis does not mean the same thing. In the first line of chapter 16, Aristotle tells us that the ilia, eŭviotis, as any other bird, and sits in summer where there is breeze and shade, but in winter in a sunny and sheltered place on the reeds round the marshes. Here the conjuncts with eŭviotis have to do with preferred resting places in summer and winter. We are also told that the ilia has a nice voice and is small in size. This chapter is fairly short and ends with a description of Anaphilos, who is said to have a beautiful color, to be resourceful in finding a living, the biomekanos, and to have a nice form. Chapter 17 discusses 5 different birds, almost as if Aristotle is transcribing a table into prose. He explains character attributions of each bird from what seem to be the same categories. Aristotle begins with the crex, which Baum notes to be possibly the corncrake or black-winged stilt, and then writes about the sippe, agalos, carytheos, and acanthios. The crex is said to be pugnacious, intelligent, vis-a-vis being resourceful in finding a living, but otherwise unlucky. The sippe is also said to be pugnacious, but as regards intelligence, adroit, orderly, and eŭviotis. Further, Aristotle explains it is said to be called a witch, a pharmakion, on account of knowing a lot. And I have a table here. Yeah. Okay. To be prolific and a good parent, and to live by pecking wood. The Agiolios usually eats at night, dwells in either rocks or caves, and as regards intelligence, it is resourceful and good at finding a living, eumekanos. The carytheos is said to be bold in character, a tree dweller that eats worms as regards intelligence, dianoion, it eŭviotis, and it has a clear voice. The acanthus, finally, is said to live poorly, kakobioi, with poor coloring but a good voice. This chapter is particularly illuminating because eŭviotis occurs twice in a well-organized context, where it can be found compared and contrasted with other character traits attributed to 5 different birds. As we saw, eŭviotis is attributed to 2 of these birds. In both instances, it is listed as a kind of intelligence. In the first occurrence, it is a conjunct with adroitness and orderliness. In the second instance, there is no conjunct. Its opposite, living poorly, kakabiotis, is attributed to another bird, given as a conjunct with poor coloring. The other traits given as examples of intelligence include resourcefulness in finding a living, the eumekanos, literally invents well or contrives well, a term we have seen Aristotle use throughout his description of birds. Eŭviotis is a concept in the same category of intelligence, never appears alongside eumekanos, nor does it seem to be contradictory to eumekanos. A possibility then is that living well is inclusive of eumekanos but moves beyond it. Considering dianoia then, it can mean a range of things, and living well is the kind of dianoia that encompasses eumekanos while including other modes of intelligence too. As a way of being intelligent, both eumekanos and eŭviotis have to do with capacities and functions of cognitive function. Dianoia, even if it is used, as Baum suggests, outside the technical human attribution given to it in the De Anima. Recall Book 9 is not about eating, but about character. In the Historia Animalium 9, there is one more occurrence each of eŭviotis and kakobiotis. In chapter 32, the mountain stork is said to have the same faults as other eagles, but none of the positive attributions. The examples then provided include that it is caught and chased by ravens and other birds, that it is heavy and lives poorly, eŭviotis, takes dead animals, is always suffering, and whimpers. Given the additional attributes provided, it seems Aristotle is describing a bird that is fairly weak in character, in capacity to function, and in body. It is hunted successfully by other birds, and yet it does not hunt other birds successfully. This means not only something about the way it eats, but also about its ability to execute hunting. It lacks resourcefulness and perhaps other capacities essential to hunting. Finally, in chapter 34, owls, night ravens, and other nocturnal birds are said to procure their food by hunting at night on account of the fact that they cannot see by day. This simple causal statement links definitively hunting with perception. One does not hunt well without seeing well. This means for most birds, they do not eat well without seeing well. By contrast, Aristotle explains that despite having defective eyes, the Phinae, likely the lammergeier according to Balm, is a good parent. Eŭviotis brings meals home, is gentle, and rears not only its own young, but those of the eagle too. This bird, despite having defective capacities, is able to eŭviotis. Okay. So the next section is about the translations of this term, eŭviotis. Only Balm's translation of the history of animals is based primarily on the Greek manuscript tradition. According to Balm, William of Morbecca's translation was intended to assist scholars to understand the Greek and was therefore a word-for-word rendering. Later translation departed from Morbecca's style, however. For example, translations of Aristotle's De Animalibus by George Trebizond and Theodore Gaza were not translated verbatim, but rather in an explanatory style. Additionally, both Trebizond and Gaza seem to have used Pliny's Naturalis Historia, Gaza more so than Trebizond, as well as a Greek-Latin word list in their translations. Gaza's translation was first prepared in 1458, but it was not until 1476 that a final draft was printed. Subsequently, it was reprinted many times. Because of its relative ubiquity and its reputation for being the leading translation at the time, Gaza's translation had widespread influence. According to Peter Bullens and Alan Gotthelf, Gaza's translation achieved an authoritative status, totally eclipsing all previous translations. Gaza's best-known impositions on the text are his renumbering of books 7 through 9, deciding that book 9 should follow book 6, becoming book 7, and thus changing book 7 to book 8 and book 8 to book 9. His reorganization of lines included in the Becker numbers 631 to 633, and his extraction of book 10 from the HA on account of his conclusion that it was spurious. However, Gaza altered the text in many other, seemingly much smaller ways, insofar as his translations were less literal than, for example, Morbecca's, and involved more interpretation on his part. In parts, the text is translated with a heavier hand than one might expect, given the near universal acceptance of Gaza's work. Bullens and Gotthelf rightly conclude that the influence Gaza's vocabulary exercised on the choices made by the biologists of the Renaissance, this field of research remains virtually untouched. Indeed, there is much about Gaza's influence in his work that is yet to be explored. And because of Trebizond's influence on Gaza, there is almost as much to explore there. Indeed, I consider passages where first Trebizond, then Gaza translate the Greek eŭviotis as examples of such vocabulary that not only change the meaning I think Aristotle intended for the term, and thus for certain sections of text, but also that influence later translators and readers of Aristotle's biology, certainly philosophers, but also perhaps biologists. To take a closer look at an example of the subtler interpretive influence we find first in Trebizond and then in Gaza's translation, I want to return to a special occurrence of eŭviotis in HA9, which is the Becker number 615A32, where Aristotle uses the prefix "u" in quadruplicate to describe the character of swans. So this is the passage. As we saw in the previous section, Aristotle's attribution of eŭviotis to some birds occurs typically as a conjunct with other descriptors. In this passage, we see those conjuncts prefixed in the same way in the Greek. When one renders this Greek especially felicitously into another language, one expects that this parallel use of a common prefix will remain. In fact, we see exactly this in William of Morebecca's 13th century translation. So here you can just see that the "u" prefix is replaced with the "bone" or "bony" descriptor. Okay. Similarly, in the 14th century Latin translation from Arabic, the preface remains consistent and felicitous even to the original Greek. In Trebizond's 15th century translation, however, the translation into medieval Latin is slightly altered. Let's see. This is another probably Rebecca. No, this is Trebizond. Trebizond partially removes the literal translation of the "u" prefix, leaving it only to describe bene nutrient beneque senescent, that the swans are good parents and age well, not far off from his previous translation of eŭviotis as victim acquirent. Trebizond here renders it facile victim acquirent, whereas Morebecca's translation rendered bios literally as simply vitae. Trebizond interprets Aristotle here to mean life vis-a-vis something acquired, possibly meaning sustenance. Although likely influenced by Trebizond's less literal style, Gaza's subsequent translation takes additional liberties in describing the attributions Aristotle made about the swans. Gaza completely removes here it is. Gaza completely removes the parallel "u" prefix present in Aristotle's description. Additionally, he translates eŭviotis as probate victis, meaning roughly that the swan appropriately or properly sustains life. However, whereas life is a broad and ambiguous term, Gaza's use of victis connotes nourishment. Whereas the pre-Gaza Latin translation rendered bios literally as simple vitae, Gaza interprets Aristotle here to mean life vis-a-vis nourishment or food. Translations of the HA into English include Thomas Taylor, 1809, Richard Cresswell, 1862, Sir Darcy Wentworth Thompson, 1910, and David Baum, 1991. Cresswell, who explains in the preface in his 1897 translation that it has been prepared from Schneider's text and that he has consistently referred to Camus' French, Strack's German, and to Taylor's English translations in completing his own, keeps Gaza's book numbers, and the chapter on seabirds is found in book 9, chapter 13. So, indicating that there's actually a felicity to Gaza's text. Okay. Thompson, who in his prefatory note famously puts forth the thesis that Aristotle's natural philosophy was the basis for and thus informed his other philosophy, retains Gaza's book organization and renders the seabird passages like this. In Thompson's table of contents, he rightly describes Book 8 as concerned with animal psychology, in particular eating habits. In Book 9, according to Thompson, there is a continuation of discussing animal psychology, but now concerning habits and intelligence. Yet while Thompson states the correct organization of theme for Books 7 and 8, or Gaza's 8 and 9, he still translates eŭviotis in Book 9 as if it had to do with nourishment, seemingly following Gaza's Latin. This is the case despite that the term does not occur in Book 7-8, the book that expressly deals with eating and feeding habits. Even in the very recent publication of a commentary on these books in Band 16 of the preeminent series Aristoteles Werke in Deutscher Übersetzung, Stefan Schneiders explains eŭviotis as, let's see if I have it. Yeah. as here, weiß ich seinen Lebensunterhalt gut zu verschaffen. Knows how to make a living or knows how to secure livelihood. Here still, post-Boehm's 20th century translation, we see the translator understands the term as descriptive of the bird's ability to meet basic needs, Lebensunterhalt. Returning to Trebizond and Gaza, we can see a similar interpolation of Gaza's interpretation of the anthesis or Pipit's life, and likewise of Gaza's influence on Thompson in the following translations of 615 A28. So here you can see the various renderings, the very felicitous pre-Gaza Latin, we could say by Morbecca, Boe Vita, Balm, it lives well, Cresswell, its mode of life good. But then we see Trebizond first with victim facile equirat, Gaza with vita commode, and then Thompson following that with it finds its food with ease. Whereas Morbecca translates the Greek literally, Trebizond and Gaza take liberties with translation. Trebizond renders bonavita as victim facile equirat at best, adding an additive verb to way of life, so that Aristotle is communicating that swans successfully acquire their way of life or are capable of sustaining their lives, but at worst, implying that a good life for swans means acquiring subsistence for life or nourishment. Following Trebizond, Gaza chooses an alternate way of rendering eŭviotis here with vita commoda. While Gaza's choice does describe a good life, in quotes here, commoda also connotes perhaps more than what Aristotle intended to convey. It suggests convenience and comfort, what does not necessarily accompany a good life. It depends what Aristotle intended by using the prefix eu in eŭviotis. And with that, I'm going to transition to discussing that eŭviotis is actually a possible analog in this chapter for what Aristotle calls eudaimonia for humans in his ethical works. So returning to the the implicit claim from earlier in the text that Aristotle's principle of teleology is present across his biology, ethics, and psychology, I will now suggest a link between his ethics and the term eŭviotis present in his biology. For Aristotle, good is neither a substance nor a quality. It is a synonym for telos, or that toward which whatever something intrinsically or naturally aims. In nature, nature determines what this is. Humans only discover or uncover it. When we talk about this sort of natural telos metaphorically, for example, when we talk about the end of a human-created tool, we sometimes lose sight of its meaning. Aristotle says good is that for which something is for. When for the particular task of his ethical project in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle wants to discover that for which human beings are, he then works to uncover a specific idea about the human good. Famously, his term is eudaimonia, which is often translated happiness or living well. Literally, the prefix eu means well. The root word daimonia can be difficult to interpret at first blush. This is because the term's principal meaning is god or goddess. However, its second or even third meaning gives us a closer look at what Aristotle probably meant when using it: one's daemon or genius, one's lot or fortune. More distant, but perhaps likewise helpful, is that Homer used the term daimones to mean the souls of men of the Golden Age, forming the link between gods and men. For the purposes of making the term as clear as possible here, I will define Aristotle's eudaimonia as using one's capacities well. For Aristotle, the human capacity in question was intellect. According to Aristotle, we use our capacity well, that is, we seek happiness always for itself. It is self-sufficient, meaning in itself it makes life complete and desirable, and it is final, meaning that nothing can improve it and it is not done for the sake of something else. It alone is the end of all human action. It is something actually desired and attainable, and presumably we know when we have it. Because of this, I will call what Aristotle is doing here the biological turn, away from the Platonic idea and toward a philosophy of living function. When he's talking about eudaimonia, or human happiness, he's talking about the state where human action has reached its highest end, where human capacity has achieved that for which it is. It is only logical then that Aristotle works to get clear about what exactly humans are for, which is to say, what is our good, or the function of our action? What is the point or aim of our natural capacities? As it turns out, this depends on what exactly our natural capacities are, a topic Aristotle covers in various works, but most extensively in his treatise on the soul, the De Anima. Reading Aristotle's account of the human good, or happiness, here is a response to the Platonic idea of good, helps put into perspective that what we are talking about is the meaning of happiness or function for every individual human. The biological turn makes the concepts of good and happiness attainable in our everyday lives, and the definitions are attached to the structure of life. But what we retain here from Plato is an understanding of the universal nature of the concepts themselves. Whatever is good is that for which humans are, and if that is happiness, whatever that is, will be the same for all humans vis-a-vis their very humanity, or whatever it is that makes them human. Determining what happiness means in this universal but attainable sense leads Aristotle to want to determine whatever might be a human's unique function. He uses examples of lyre players, sculptors, carpenters, and others to help us think about what function means in a human context. When we think about it in terms of the types of activities undertaken by artists and craftspeople, we can easily point to the end or aim of their activity, thus to what we would consider to be the good of their activity. We expect the lyre player to play the lyre well, the sculptor to render his sculpture well, the carpenter to build her house well, etc. For each of these, we are thinking about the proper end of a human activity, but we are still not talking about the final, self-sufficient, universal end of all human activity. What we do see, however, is the analogy Aristotle is working to create as part of his biological turn. Similarly, he mentions discrete parts of our bodies whose function we know well, the eye, hand, and foot. These parts are integral to the overall functioning of the human animal, but they can be easily thought about in terms of their individual functions. When our feet function well, we ambulate with ease, contributing to our larger or broad life pursuits. We move toward desires and generally go about life without thinking about the functioning of our feet. When our feet stop functioning or stop functioning well, for example, in the case of blisters, we notice the contribution our feet's proper functioning make to our overall existence. We realize the good of feet or what they are for the sake of. But even in the terrible circumstance where we lose our feet or lose all function of our feet, we are still human. Aristotle uses the example of discrete body parts then to illustrate the concept of function and good, but not yet to articulate what the human good or function is. He wants us to see living organisms as directed at an activity in a similar way to how we humans take on various goal-directed activities as a way of expressing particular capacities or desires, or as the way our various anatomical parts have functions for which they exist and operate. As organisms, we have a similarly natural capacity for an activity that is in situ well beyond or before our occasion to choose it. This is in contrast to the aim of the carpenter. While generally all humans have the capacity to be a carpenter, only some will undertake this activity. It is those who undertake it who then are functioning well at it when they produce a sufficient building. Then we could say, are humans functioning as humans qua builders? The human function, by contrast, is functioning well when we are living well, qua humans. It is the natural part of us that for Aristotle defines us. It is the exercise of the most basically human constituent of our being. Finally, Aristotle explains what he believes to be the uniquely human good or function. The reference he makes in the argument to get us there comes directly from the De Anima, his work on solar psychic function. The way Aristotle understands soul, to put it most simply, is a unity of all biological activities that pertain for a living organism. While we unfortunately do not have time now to work through the specific arguments and details he offers in the De Anima, we can report what he says here in the Nicomachean Ethics. He entertains that living itself might be the broader human activity for which humans are. He quickly decides, however, that plants also live, and excuses the idea that life could be the human good or function, because nutrition and growth are activities argued in the De Anima to be concomitant to talking about life generally, or the very definition of living. Aristotle dismisses both of these activities as candidates for being the human good or function. Next, he considers the activity of perception, but recognizes that all non-human animals share in all animals share in having various capacities of perception and in their activities. Finally, then, he considers reason. On the basis of his conclusion in the De Anima that humans alone have the capacity for, and thus the activity of reason, he now concludes reason to be the uniquely human function or good. Aristotle then considers which type of reasoning he intends to qualify for the human good, and he discusses two. The first is obedience to reason, while the second is the exercise of reason. Aristotle quickly determines the latter to be the properly human function. The activity of reason is the activity whose end is in itself. If we are to believe Aristotle's previous claims about the aim that would qualify for the final aim or good for human beings, the activity of reason will be self-sufficient. It will be that which makes human life desirable and complete in itself. Aristotle's final point in this argument is that there is a difference between functioning and functioning well. He gives the example of the lyre player whose function is to play the lyre, and the good lyre player whose function is to play the lyre well. While the function is technically the same in both cases, where there is a capacity to do something well as opposed to just doing it, doing the function well is inherently best. Aristotle returns to the good of a human to say that a human being's unique function is an activity of the soul in accordance with reason, thus performing this activity well is going to be the activity of the good human being. Aristotle thus establishes a double sense of good, the good found in the exercise of the unique function, and then the well performance of this good. He concludes that the exercise of this activity must be over the course of a life. Given that he has just argued for the human function qua the good of human life, it only makes sense that this functioning happens as a course of the very life for which it presents a teleological end or purpose. So one question to ask here is, what specifically is the teleological analog, both the end and the capacity for the end, in other non-human animals? While this is a big question, and unfortunately I can't get to it all here, let's look at a smaller question. Given that Aristotle's zoological works compose 1/3 of his extant corpus, did Aristotle have an analogous idea and or term for non-human animal happiness, or using their capacities well? Given that Aristotle is clear in his natural philosophy that all living beings have an end, or a telos, and that he has much to say about non-human animal capacities and activities across his psychological and zoological texts, I think it makes sense that he would. In fact, I think it makes sense that a logical candidate is eŭviotis. Given the way Aristotle uses the concept of good across his ethical, psychological, and biological works, this term means the well-functioning and exercise of life, whatever that life is capable of. In the Historia Animalium 9, Aristotle is talking about character and describing various typical activities in which birds engage as a course of life. He discusses friendship and enmity, reproduction and child rearing, nest building, vocalizations, resourcefulness, ingenuity, intelligence, color, appearance, etc. While it is true that he mentions the procurement of food, he does so in two specific contexts. First, in the context of explaining motivations for certain animal characteristics. This was seen, for example, in friendship and enmity. Scarcity can create enmity, while abundance can pave the way for friendship and friendliness. And second, in the context of resourcefulness with finding food. Here, the emphasis is on the character of resourcefulness, which, as we discussed previously, might be an attribute that contributes to eŭviotis, but it is not synonymous with it. When Aristotle uses his neologism eŭviotis, rather he seems to be suggesting an appropriate and successful way of life, given surroundings, other species, and individual capacities. As David Bohm explains in a footnote to Aristotle's opening passage in Book 8, Aristotle's naturalist account of non-human animal character comes from his idea that such traits result from the sensitive powers of soul, particularly desire and imagination, and overlaps with his more thorough discussion of soul powers in De Anima 3, 10 through 12, and the Nicomachean Ethics 1. As Bohm puts it, these are all the same analysis, which is to say that in his work in zoology, in his work in cognition or powers of soul, and his work on human ethics, Aristotle is presenting a consistent theory concerning the way organisms are defined by their powers of soul. When we consider HA9 in the context of Aristotle's corpus as consistent with his psychology, eŭviotis may very well be used to describe the well-functioning of the particular animal species in its context. This interpretation is supported when we think of the term as analogous to the way Aristotle uses eudaimonia in his ethical works. Why might Trebizond, Gaza, and future translators, for example, scholars like Thompson, have missed or eschewed this interpretation? One possibility is that their translations were already biased because of a preconceived idea about what it would mean for an animal to live well. Camille comments on such a bias existing among illustrators of De Animalibus's medieval manuscripts, when he writes, "One aspect of Aristotle's biology which was disturbing to many Christian commentators was his viewing humans and animals as part of the same continuum, which of course Christianity could not accept, viewing the animal world as inherently inferior, but also as a mirror for man." Aristotle had an entirely different concept about the relatedness of humans to non-humans, as well as a naturalist rather than a religious understanding of non-human animal being and potential. The Christian stewards of Aristotle's text nearly erase this crucial difference. If the reason is not bias against non-human animals, it may be the case that both Trebizond and Gaza's rendering of eŭviotis as victim facile acquirit and probitate victis vita commode respectively, along with their general style to translate passages less felicitously to the Greek and Arabic than had been done previously, misled some later scholars. In the case of Thompson's English translation, which was quite influential at least prior to Balmes's, we see this to such a degree that what may have been Aristotle's original intent for the meaning of the word was lost, as if it were in play during a game of telephone. This is to say that without access to other translations or to manuscripts of the HA, later scholars were already at a disadvantage in their translations of the text because, first, the terms Gaza used to translate the Greek ou prefix, for example, commode and probitate, are ambiguous, and that they lack ambiguity when contrasted with Aristotle's ou. These terms both connote propriety. And second, in the case of 615a32, without the parallel use of a good prefix, one is potentially misled about Aristotle's original meaning. He was describing the swan as carrying out various functions well, one of which was living. This meaning is lost when the parallel ou or good attribution is removed. In the case of the parallel uses of ou, eŭviotoi, and eŭetes, the good-hearted nature, and the eutechnoi, blessed with children, and the egoiroi, the ages well as the use of good at finding a living, skillful at contriving, ingenious ekimenias out, ou mechanos, alongside eŭviotoi, shows both that Aristotle is using the ou prefix to mean that certain things are being done better than is absolutely necessary, and also that, to repeat a previous point, since Aristotle uses a mechanos alongside eŭviotis, and that the words would not likely mean the exact same thing. The bios being referred to as the bird bios here would logically mean that the bird in question is doing well vis-a-vis whatever might chiefly constitute a bird life. And perhaps most importantly, third, the choice of translating bios as victus meant that a new connotation, nourishment or eating, was added to Aristotle's work on animal psychology, potentially replacing, or at the least, obscuring Aristotle's originally intended meaning. Trebizond's choice to add facile acquirit, implying that life is acquired or sustained, may have added support for the rendering. The implication is that some readers of these scholarly translations came to understand the bird life as ou, when the bird was eating enough, effectively dismissing the many other ways birds function in their lives, and thus the many other possible ways they could be described as eŭviotis. Given what we have already said about the command Aristotle's biological works held in the history of biology and on our cultural understanding of non-human animals, even in the 19th century, this implication is indeed a serious one. A final consideration is the condition of the manuscript with which translators like Trebizond and Gaza were working. In his preface to his translation of De Animalibus, Gaza writes, "Another cause of my labor was that the Greek manuscripts we have of the books called On Animals are very seriously flawed, owing either to the scribes or to that accident about which we read in Strabo the geographer." In addition to the flaws of the manuscript in the additional issue that, as Berger states in her work on the history of the text of the HA, the oldest handwritten fragment of the Historia Animalium comes from the Arabic translation from the 9th century, which is already separated from the author by more than 1,000 years. Whether on account of scholarly bias, especially anthropocentric bias, a translation and commentary tradition begun using a flawed medieval rendering of a text already far removed from its author, and thus perhaps from the author's original intent. I agree with David Bohm's assessment that eŭviotis does not mean feeding well, but living well in Aristotle's biology. Eŭviotis, according to Bohm, is applied to birds several times in HA 8 or 9. It is coupled with beauty, song, happiness, pleasing behavior, and seems to denote more than an easy food supply. It suggests that the birds live successfully in its surroundings. The opposite is not duobiotis, living in hardship, but kakobios, living poorly. Bohm's contrast between living deus and kako here is helpful. Eŭviotis is not accomplished as the result of plentiful resources contra deus. Rather, it is the case because of something the birds have been able to do well, rather than poorly. This suggests that the birds have been able to exercise some ability, both as regards an internal capacity or potential, and as regards a lack of external prohibition for the internal capacity to function, for example, a conducive habitat. The animal lives well because she is capable of living well, and because her surroundings are such that the capacity can be regularly exercised. I likewise agree with Peter Bullians that there is a chain of influence among the various translators of the Historia Animalium that may account for infelicities, rather than it being attributable to any one scholar. In the end, the medieval renderings of Aristotle's greatest biological works added meaning to the classical texts that disrupted our historical understanding of Aristotle's view of some animals. This disruption is still seen in some 20th century translations. While the original infelicity was likely caused by implicit anthropocentrism, it was abetted by a translation and commentary tradition begun using a flawed medieval rendering of a text already far removed from the author, perhaps from the author's original intent. Having considered the textual additions, the circumstances, and the context both of the occurrences of the term in eŭviotis and HA 9, and of Aristotle's zoology in the context of the greater corpus, I agree with David Bohm's assessment that eŭviotis does not mean feeding well, but living well in Aristotle's Historia Animalium. Thank you.